unconventionally produced. These include things like dioxins and furans, which are extremely toxic. Hexachlorobenzene and PCBs can also be unintentionally produced through incineration and other chemical manufacturing processes. One of the most important bodies of the Stockholm Convention is the Persistent Organic Pollutants Review Committee, or the POPROC as it's fondly called. And this is the scientific committee of the Stockholm Convention that assesses proposals from any party, that is a country, that would like to nominate or name a chemical that should be listed as a persistent organic pollutant in Annexes A, B, or C of the Convention. And this is a really impressive body of scientists from all over the world. There are 31 POPROC members, and I'll talk a little bit about the makeup of the POPROC. Here you see the POPs Review Committee at work. Generally, the POPs Review Committee has met in Geneva, Switzerland once a year. Last year, in October of 2013, the POPs Review Committee met in October in Rome. And you see in the upper left-hand corner the chair of, the outgoing chair, I should say, of the POPs Review Committee, Rainer Arndt from Germany. And at his side is Kei Ono, who is part of the Secretariat of the Stockholm Convention, which is part of the United Nations. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but you can see the makeup of the POPs Review Committee shifts depending on the year. But the Stockholm Convention countries really worked to ensure broad representation from all the different areas of the world and all the countries that are a part of the convention. So at any one time there are 8 scientific representatives from the African nations, 8 from Asian and Pacific nations, 3 from Central and Eastern European nations, 5 from Latin American and Caribbean nations, and then Western European and other nations have 7 representatives. So at any one time there's very broad and diverse geographic representation from the countries that are part of the convention. And I should say also, this is very important, that indigenous and non-governmental organizations have really been vital both in the negotiation and the implementation of the treaty. Vaiwahi, you see here in the upper left-hand corner and the right corner there, has been a part of the Global Indigenous Caucus. She's from St. Lawrence Island, Yupik from St. Lawrence Island. In the lower left-hand corner, Tiffany Immigan is a youth representative from Savunga on St. Lawrence Island. And in the lower right-hand corner, you see our small team of International POPs Elimination Network technical folks who participate in the POPs Review Committee each year. This is Eva Kromel from the Inuit Circumpolar Council. This is me, Emily Marquez from the Pesticide Action Network, and Mario Watts, also from Pesticide Action Network. Indigenous representatives to the Stockholm Convention have organized themselves excuse me, as, in a global indigenous caucus that includes representation from Central and South America, Africa, Asia, and North America. And this group of people has really been a force, I think, to remind people of the human rights obligations and the critical health issues that indigenous communities face. This is just a little bit about the process for listing a POP. Any nation that is a party to the convention can nominate a particular chemical, and then that chemical gets referred to the Scientific Review Committee, or the POPROC, for assessment. And there are 3 stages of the assessment. Annex D, which is the screening process, and a chemical has to be determined to be a persistent organic pollutant based on the following criteria: persistence, bioaccumulation, its capability for long-range transport, and adverse human and environmental health effects. And there are certain scientific criteria that each chemical has to meet, so the Scientific Review Committee undergoes a lengthy review process in this stage of the screening process. Then, if a chemical is found to meet those screening criteria, it moves to the next stage, which is Annex E, or the risk profile stage, which is a more in-depth assessment of the chemical's properties. And I think one key provision of the convention is that a lack of full scientific certainty shall not prevent the proposal, that is for the substance, to proceed. And that's really important because we don't necessarily have all of the information that we need about every chemical to understand its full range of environmental and health effects. But if there is a good, solid body of evidence, then the chemical should proceed to the next level of evaluation, which is Annex F, where the committee prepares a risk management evaluation, and that includes an assessment of socioeconomic consideration as well as alternatives. And then if it goes through all of those stages, the chemical is recommended by the POP-ROC to the full conference of parties. Again, over 170 nations are a part of that, and they make a decision about whether it should be listed under the global legally binding provisions of the treaty. This includes, this slide shows some of the milestones of the convention. The countries came together in 1997, largely because of concerns about the high levels of persistent pollutants in the breast milk of Inuit women living in the far north of Canada. And that was a scientific finding that really surprised everyone, I think prompted the negotiation and then ultimate signing of the treaty. So you see kind of the stages there. In 2001, many countries, including the United States, signed the global legally binding treaty, now known as the Stockholm Convention. In May 2004, the convention entered into force, and in 2009, 9 new chemicals in addition to the original 12 were added. Endosulfan was added in 2011, and in 2013, an additional chemical, which I'll talk about later, HBCD, was added for global elimination. And although the U.S. signed the treaty under the Bush administration, the Senate has not yet ratified it, so the U.S. is not considered an official party to the convention. There were 9 new chemicals I mentioned in 2009. These were 8 substances that were listed under Annex A for global elimination, and I won't spend a lot of time on these, but I'll go through them individually, and you can see them there, and I'll have a slide about each of them as we go along here. Lindane was listed in 2009. This was a chemical that was nominated by Mexico for listing under the convention, and it went through a very long review process by the Scientific Review Committee. These are some of the both health effects. It was used as a broad spectrum insecticide. It's also used as a pharmaceutical to treat head lice in children. And I should mention that it's still allowed by our Food and Drug Administration to be administered to the heads of children to treat head lice, which we've strongly opposed. We think it's a very serious neurotoxicant, for example, and has a range of health effects that are listed here, but it should not be applied to the heads of children. And there is an exemption that will expire very soon, an exemption for the pharmaceutical use, even though it's been phased out as an insecticide. One of the reasons that prompted concern about this is not only is it a global contaminant that is accumulating in the Arctic, but for every ton of the pesticide lindane, there are about 9 tons of other persistent pollutants that are associated with the production of the actual pesticide. And these are different forms of hexachlorocyclohexane, or HCH, alpha and beta. So, and these are not used as pesticides, they're simply waste. So there's a lot of persistent toxic waste associated with the production of this chemical, and that was also a big concern when discussing this at the Stockholm Convention. As early as 1962, Rachel Carson in her book Silent Spring brought forth warnings about the pesticide lindane, and yet it took decades for this chemical to be phased out even in the U.S. and now internationally. I mentioned the other forms of HCH. Alpha HCH is simply a different form of the gamma isomer, which is lindane, of this chemical, and it carries its own very serious environmental and health threats that are mentioned here. One interesting finding was that the traditional foods of Arctic indigenous peoples were really at risk because the levels were found to exceed safe reference values, and that was another reason that prompted the U.S. to phase out this chemical, and perhaps EPA can talk a little bit more about that later. This is another form of HCH, and again, I won't dwell on it. It has many of the same health effects, and it's produced as waste in lindane manufacturing. Chlordecone was another pesticide that was among the 9 chemicals that were phased out in 2009. In Annex A, that means no exemptions. That means no uses can continue for that chemical on a global basis. And you can see some of the uses that this pesticide was used internationally, and some of the health effects. And it was determined to be a POP, and again went through the 3 stages of review. And this was a pesticide that all of the nations of the world that are party to the convention could agree required global elimination. Hexabromobiphenyl, again, one of the other chemicals that was added in 2009. And I should say that one of the real strengths of this globally legally binding treaty is the provisions that allow for the addition of new chemicals. And I think that's one of the reasons that really merit why the Stockholm Convention merits our concern and attention and advocacy and work to include new chemicals that might have global effects. So HBB was used as a fire retardant in certain types of plastics. Again, a range of very serious health effects, including different types of cancers and thyroid disease. And this chemical was listed in 2009 in Annex A of the Convention with no exemptions. Pentachlorobenzene, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each of these slides because it's just a lot of chemicals and chemical name soup, so I won't spend a lot of time, but the information is here, and Jennifer said she'd send the slides around to everybody, and of course if you have any questions I'd be glad to answer them. There's no intentional use of this chemical, but it has been found in the following uses, and now it's listed including in the production of PCBs, in dyes, flame retardants, and pesticides, and this was listed in 2009 for global elimination. Another flame retardant, octabromodiphenyl ether. Again, this was a flame retardant chemical, a toxic flame retardant chemical, primarily used in certain types of plastics, in electronics, and as with many of the other brominated flame retardants, it's a very serious toxicant, particularly to the thyroid system. One of the things that was very controversial in the discussions about the elimination of these polybrominated diphenyl ethers in 2009 was that certain countries wanted to allow an exemption to permit the recycling. We think of recycling as a good thing, but in this case it would allow the recycling of products containing brominated flame retardants into other products. And we felt that this was against the spirit and intent of the Stockholm Convention to protect human health and the environment. These are some of the types of products that these brominated flame retardants can be recycled into, and including children's toys. So this was a very great concern, and this is something that the Scientific Review Committee is now wrestling with, because I think that it was a big mistake to allow this recycling exemption, because this essentially allows the recycling of persistent organic pollutants into products that we use every day in our homes. And this includes not only toys and other children's products, but also carpet padding, which children can be exposed to because they're close to the ground and doing a lot of hand-to-mouth behavior.
Pam, you are at about 30 minutes. We're at
okay, I'll move through this
9:40.
pretty. Okay, thank you, Jen. So Penta is another flame retardant that was phased out in 2009, again with the exemption to allow recycling. Perfluorooctane sulfonate is one of the stain-resistant chemicals, and this was listed in Annex B, again a very controversial chemical that's widely used for stain-resistant applications and dispersive uses, even as a pesticide. It's listed, and the Scientific Review Committee is now wrestling with looking at alternatives that can replace the need for this chemical. Endosulfan pesticide was phased out in 2011, and this again was a pesticide that really has global impacts and is accumulating in the Arctic. In 2013, the Stockholm Convention Conference of Parties that met in April of 2013 agreed to phase out this flame retardant, which is used in insulation, house insulation, polystyrene, expanded and extruded building insulation. And this was listed in Annex A of the convention with a limited exemption. And this gives some of the health effects of this chemical HBCD. So several countries have nominated some new chemicals which are under various stages of review by the POPs Review Committee. Hexachlorobutadiene is a chemical that is unintentionally produced in incineration and in the production of chlorinated solvents, and it just finished the 3 stages of review and is recommended now to the full conference of parties for listing, as are chlorinated naphthalenes, the next substance. Again, unintentional production is the largest source, although it had past uses in paints and oils and other substances, and again this was also recommended for listing. Pentachlorophenol is now in Annex F, so it's in the final stage of review, and we hope it'll be recommended for elimination with no exemptions. Deca-BDE is another type of flame retardant. It's in the middle stage of review in Annex E, the risk profile stage, and there are intersessional working groups going on right now to prepare further information on this substance. And these 2 other substances, dicofol, a pesticide, and short-chain chlorinated paraffins, were nominated, but they're kind of in limbo right now, and they'll be considered, but their consideration was delayed. I'm just going to mention this very briefly. Some of you may know that Congress is currently considering reforms of the Toxic Substances Control Act, which is the only major law that hasn't been revised since inception in the 1970s, and we've been working very hard on this as well. Right now there's a bill in Congress that we think is a bad bill, the Chemical Safety Improvement Act, that has many deficiencies, not protecting vulnerable populations, and these other, we think, inadequacies, including that it does not contain implementing language to allow the U.S. to participate as a party in the Stockholm Convention. This has been a very important issue to Alaska tribes, and at the most recent meeting of the Alaska Federation of Natives, they supported a resolution for very strong federal chemicals policy. These are some resources that I wanted to refer you to that I think might be helpful. And I think that's it. Thank you so much, and I'm sorry for going over for a few minutes there.
It's okay. Thank you very much, Pam. I'm going to take controls back, and before we go to questions, we have EPA staff attending, and so they will introduce themselves and discuss EPA's role and involvement with the Stockholm Convention and anything else they would like to share. John Schoaf, do you have capability to unmute yourself? Okay, I'm waiting for EPA staff to introduce themselves.
Hi, can you hear us now, Jennifer?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Sorry about that. I unmuted one line, but not perhaps the other. Just for those on the webinar phone, my name is John Stokes. I'm the Chief of the Liaison Branch in the Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics at US EPA. We're getting a little feedback, but I'll continue. I'm sorry for the echo. Why don't I go around the rest of the room here in terms of who's here from the agency, and we'll speak also to our role and involvement in a moment.
This is Kristen Hendricks with the Office of Pesticide Programs. Ana Corrado with the Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics.
Chris Blanc with the Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics.
And this is Carissa Kovner, and I am in the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, which is the sort of overarching office that manages toxic and pesticides.
So maybe before we jump in, can you hear us okay?
You're a little echoey, but I don't know what we can do about that because you're all on one phone.
Okay. Well, we'll proceed. Thank you for bearing with us. I'm going to turn it over now to Carissa to give an introduction of mostly how we've been involved with the Stockholm Convention over time and what our role is. And then we'd be happy to also answer questions thereafter.
Thank you, everyone. This is Carissa Kovner, and Pam, nice to hear your voice. I think we recognize many of your names from over the years. So the U.S. as an overall government has had a very long and persistent career with the Stockholm Convention. EPA in particular, obviously with the expertise some of which you have in this room and across the agency, we have a lot of folks that focus on either the particular substances that are listed under the Stockholm Convention or substances that have the characteristics that we characterize as PBT chemicals. So back in the time, as Pam mentioned, sort of during the actual negotiations, the U.S. government was a very strong contributor to the negotiations of this agreement. I think as I look back at those times, the value that I think EPA and the U.S. government brought to those negotiations was the scientific strength of what we had to offer. And so when I look at the substances that are listed, and I agree with Pam that those substances were defined as the dirty dozen at the time, and they were intended to be chemicals that had significant global concern, and the intention of the obligations of the treaty was to reduce the sort of stresses that these chemicals put upon the environment. So in that context, as the negotiations continued and the POPROC, which is the review committee that Pam mentioned, was negotiated, it was intended to be a treaty that was flexible and that could evolve over time to address additional chemicals. And the mandate of the POPROC was to look at those chemicals. And I think as you look around the room that we have here, many of our U.S. experts to the POPROC are sitting here, and we would be happy to answer any questions you have about that process. But that process is an important one because it's what allows the convention to evolve over time and to address the more emerging concerns that back as we were negotiating this in the 90s, may not have been of concern or weren't known to be of concern, and the real value of the treaty is to be able to address those kinds of issues. So to the extent that you have any questions about that, we are happy to answer that. EPA as an agency has the lead for that particular process under Stockholm, and as Pam mentioned, once a chemical has been looked at by the POPROC, which takes about 5 years, I think what we're seeing is an average chemical to go through that process takes about 5 years. At the end of it, it goes to the Conference of the Parties, which is the political body of the convention. The State Department leads that particular process for the U.S. government. We, as an agency, play strongly in that, but it is a collaborative effort across all of the agencies. So to the extent that you have questions that may go outside of our particular areas of expertise, we're happy to answer those or to get back to you with some consultations with our appropriate sister agencies on these issues. It's an important treaty for us. We invested a lot of time and effort in the negotiation of it to make sure that we felt it was capable of carrying the weight that the world was hoping it would. We are, as Pam noted, not parties. That makes many of us here very sad, and it's something that we have been working on over time. There have been some legislative opportunities since we signed it in 2001, and we have tried to make the most of those opportunities. But to the extent that you guys are still working hard on that, we are too, and we appreciate those efforts and hope that in the near future the U.S. will be a party. I think you probably have heard that we were the first joiner of the Mercury Convention, which I hope at least signals our continued commitment to an international, chemical regime that works and that, brings into consideration the issues that are important to you and the issues that are important to us. So while we are certainly disappointed that we remain non-parties to the Stockholm Convention, we are committed to participating. I think Pam will tell you she sees us a lot, probably more than she wants to at some of these meetings, and that we do our best to bring the scientific rigor and the U.S. concerns, to the forefront at those meetings, and we look forward to continuing to do so in whatever role we have. So with that, I don't want to take too much time. I know you have a big program on your hands today. So if you'd like to, ask us questions, or if you'd like to move forward with your program and leave those questions for us towards the end, however you guys want to manage this, Jennifer, just let us know.
Okay, well, I'm going to open it up for questions. You can type your questions in, or you can raise your hand in your bar, and I can unmute your line for you to speak. So whichever you prefer. I'm going to go ahead and start with Larry. Okay, Larry, go ahead. And if you could identify yourself and then ask your question.
I'm Larry Dunn, right? And my question is, as I understand it, it requires, I guess it's Congress to ratify our acceptance and joining the Stockholm Convention. If that's the case, what do you think the probability of that occurring in the near future is?
Larry, is that identified to PAM or EPA?
To EPA.
This is Carissa Kovner again. Just to make sure I understood your question, the phone was going in a little bit, in and out a little bit, but I heard your question to be that since the U.S. joining the Stockholm Convention would require action on behalf of the Senate, what's the likelihood that we expect that to happen?
Yes.
Well, that's a loaded question, but a very good one. So what we need as a government to join the treaty are two things. The first thing that we need is legislation that would allow us to be in compliance with all of the obligations. And while we think we are pretty close to having most of the pieces, there are a couple of aspects of the convention that neither FIFRA, which is our pesticide law, nor TSCA, our toxics law, currently contain. So the first thing that we need before anybody can even think about allowing us to join would be changes to FIFRA and to TSCA, or at least some sort of legislative language that would cover the changes that we would need in those two bills to get through Congress. Speaking generically and putting aside, chemical treaties, environmental treaties, or anything else, action in Congress has not taken place with respect to this. I don't have any ability to forecast when that might happen. We remain forever hopeful. The TSCA reform bill has given some, brought some attention to these issues. Whether that'll be enough, I don't know. It's a good question. We hope so. We hope that there's all sorts of things that could trigger Senate action. And after that would require so at that, once we have the changes that we need, I would assume that advice and consent would be much easier to obtain. But it'll take action to get us the actual underlying implementing laws prior to seeking advice and consent. And the timeline is undetermined.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and unmute the next question by Diane Barton. Can you please state your name and question?
Yeah, this is Diane Barton. I'm with the National Tribal Toxics Council. I was just wondering more about the international approaches to chemical management, the specifically the SAICM, which is came out of the 2006 Conference on Chemicals Management. So to me, it seems like this is a strategy to potentially link, the European REACH program to, future incarnations, let's say, of TSCA. And, I just don't understand the role that the parties to the Stockholm Convention play in that, or even if the U.S. has agreed to be part of it. And this is also related to the Dubai Declaration on Chemical Management. So I just wonder how that's related, if at all.
Yeah, hi, Diane. This is John Schoaf. I think I can field that one. Just for broader context for everyone, this is in regard to the strategic approach to international chemicals management, what we call under international parlance or acronyms as SAICM. And it was agreed in Dubai, I think, in 2006 at the International Convention on Chemicals Management. It is sort of a broad framework for collaboration or cooperation on chemicals management, and includes not only countries but also any number of partners and stakeholders with a seat at the table. So it's a little bit different than a convention in some ways. It's voluntary. It's not mandatory, so it doesn't necessarily set out hard obligations, but it also allows a seat at the table for really everyone that's interested, which is sort of a unique design. There have been some other aspects to it that are, I think, complementary to efforts under the convention. So, for instance, they have a small trust fund or quick start program, as they call it, where they have helped to coordinate different activities in different places on chemicals management. They also have endeavored to work on certain emerging policy issues, which kind of span a range of interest areas or activities, and we've been involved in some of those as well. And within sort of your intergovernmental organizations like the UN Environment Program, which acts as the secretariat for many of these conventions, they also help to host this the SAICM, and they coordinate oftentimes across secretariats, between the Stockholm Convention and other similar chemicals management activities. So I hope that helps sort of provide a flavor for what it is. Ana Corrado, who's on our team here, also helps do some work on that in certain specific areas with emerging policy issues, among others. So if there's other questions, or if you want to add anything on it.
Yeah, I just will highlight the complementary way that they work. SAICM, as John was saying, it's not a treaty, so it's not an obligation. Don't want to duplicate what the Stockholm is doing, but also can complement. One example is our work on the long chain perfluorinated chemicals, which is dealing with a larger set of perfluorinated chemicals and not only the PFOS that are listed under the Stockholm Convention. So that's a way that we can complement the work under the convention.
Thank you. I also unmuted Pam. It's the combination of lines that's causing an echo. So Pam, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you. I just wanted to go back to Larry's question about the implementing legislation and what it's going to take to get Congress to act on this, and it does have to be ratified by the Senate. But I want to say that this will not happen without pressure from individuals and tribes. So we're working to actively engage people to pressure the Senate to take action to pass strong language in the Toxic Substances Control Act in the discussions around the new law that will replace the Toxic Substances Control Act. And also, as Carissa mentioned, FIFRA, the pesticide law, also needs to be amended. But the thing that I wanted to point out here is this will not happen without all of us engaging, and this is probably something EPA can't say. We have to put direct pressure on the senators to take action to show that this is a very critical human health and human rights issue. And then just one resource that I wanted to mention, it's in the little section of resources that I provided on one of my slides. The Center for International Environmental Law has a really good paper that evaluates what is needed in terms of implementing language in both the Toxic Substances Control Act and FIFRA to ensure U.S. participation in the Stockholm Convention. So I just wanted to mention that. And thank you. And with regard to SciChem, I also want to say that it is not legally binding, as others have mentioned, but another great provision of it is that it does allow for participation of civil society, and the International POPs Elimination Network is very actively engaged in that. And another really interesting section of discussion is about chemicals in products, because a lot of exposures are occurring through household products. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. That's all.
Thanks, Pam. Jacob, you're unmuted if you'd like to state your question. Okay, he doesn't have a mic. So this question is from Jacob Terrence. And Pam, it's for you. How are new proposals for additions to the Stockholm Convention initiated?
Good question, Jacob. Any country that is a party to the convention can nominate a new substance. So, for instance, Lindane was nominated by Mexico. Deca-BDE was nominated by Norway. So any country can nominate a chemical, but we as non-governmental organizations that are not party to the convention, we as the U.S. government are observers, so we can't nominate chemicals. We can help strengthen the scientific case for those chemicals, but a country that is an official party to the convention has to be the nominating party.
Okay, I have a question from Vi. Would you like to introduce yourself and state your question?
This is my Wai. I'm a Native Village Savonga tribal member. I'm a mother and grandmother. And I have more of a statement and comment directed toward EPA. Carissa mentioned that EPA has a long, consistent career to focus on substances that will be listed on the Stockholm Convention, and that they're the lead in the process of the Stockholm Convention, and the State Department takes the lead in the top rock. And the role that the EPA has contributed has brought scientific strength. My comment is, I'm from Sitting Island, Savonga. As Pam mentioned in her presentation, we have the burden of proof has been put on us. We have had to do our own community-based research, and we have done so very successfully since 2000. addressing our concerns from the two former Air Force bases on our island, but global contaminants. We are some of the most highly contaminated population on the planet because of our reliance on our subsistence food. As Pam explained, in our region, we have 16 communities in Norton Sound. We're behind Little Diary. They are very isolated. Only access to Little Diary is during the winter. They eat the most traditional food in our region, and St. Lawrence Island is behind them. 80% of our hens eat only traditional food. Now, our traditional food is killing my people. In 2011 and 2012, we averaged 19 cancer deaths in a population of about 1,500 people, St. Lawrence Island people. And in 2013, I feel that they increased threefold. We are calling upon EPA to take a lead and to urge and make legislation, to implement legislation to do that, so that the United States of America, which St. Lawrence people are a member of, to ratify the Stockholm Convention, because we are at the receiving end of these global contaminants, even though we don't have manufacturers of chemical plants. We are experiencing environmental violence from these global contaminants. They are affecting the health and well-being, not only cancer, but so many other illnesses. Now we need EPA and the State Department to step forward to make changes so that our people are protected. Our public health has been harmed by these global contaminants. Our basic human rights to food and subsistence, our basic human rights to health, human rights to free and prior informed consent, and also to fix broken chemical and environmental laws like that. We are hotspots. That language needs to be implemented in the Chemical Safety Improvement Act. It is not protective of people like mine on St. Lawrence Island. And Carissa mentioned that the U.S. brings scientific strength. Well, our community-based research data is scientific sound. It shows that these global contaminants have greatly affected the health and well-being of our people. So I'm calling on EPA on this webinar to step forward to help so that our chemical and environmental laws are fixed, so that people like ours are St. Lawrence Island are helping our being in our future generations are protected, and that corporations need to be held accountable. Thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer, this is Carissa. And it was a little bit difficult to hear that. I think what I heard, and I just want to give a quick summary, and then if there were parts that we didn't hear, if we could maybe ask you to help us fill in a little bit. I heard sort of the noting that there's a lot of difficulty in getting the appropriate sort of research and science at the table, and that to do so take a lot of their time, but that there's been a lot of contributions in that area, and I think we would certainly agree with that, and that the geography and the location make these areas sort of hot spots for these chemicals, and obviously has a direct impact on sort of their traditional food sources and the health and safety of the environment and their people. And the encouragement was to sort of call upon EPA and states to take a more of an active role, if I heard that correctly, in encouraging the Senate to pass legislation to address sort of the range of significant concerns that were identified. And I just, if I can take a minute to just, that I realized was a bit of a quick summary of what was a much well-presented position, but I want to make sure that I heard the encouragement correctly.
Yes, I didn't have any changes that you need quick action. People are dying. We have so many cancers. Our cancers are getting younger. And cancer is killing our people. We don't have adequate healthcare also. We need help today. I mean, this is a process that's globally binding. So EPA and the State Department need to take a leading role, because I tried getting hardest and in Alaska, we are experiencing health disparities. So we need immediate action. This is a crisis, a cancer crisis, health crisis.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and certainly, you know, obviously, it's a moving time for all of us. I will say that I can speak personally from having heard Jim Jones, who is our assistant administrator for toxics and pesticides, speak many times of the need for reform and the encouragement by EPA for Congress to take action. I know that we have many employees whose sole job at the moment is dedicated to, you know, following the work of the Congress on the reform efforts, and to provide as much support and help as we can for those efforts. I think anyone who watches the news could say this as easily as I will, but there's definitely some difficulties in reaching consensus on a number of issues, including environmental issues, up on Capitol Hill. And so what I heard from you was an impassioned, you know, request for us to do the most that we can, and I can assure you that we are. And I think our regret at the moment is that those opportunities are not as prevalent as we would like. And I have heard both the President and our own administrators speak passionately about the need for chemical reform, that we are, as an agency, 100% behind that. And we are working in that direction as the opportunities present themselves, and as we can make those opportunities present themselves. So I appreciate that, and I heard Pam talk a little, I think it was Pam or Jennifer talk a little bit about the efforts that you guys are doing, and we are doing the same. And I think together one can hope, and we are certainly doing that.
Pam, go ahead.
Yeah, just in response to Vi's statement, I just want to highlight that Vi has really played a significant role in the Stockholm Convention as a leader within the Global Indigenous Caucus, and bringing the very urgent health and human rights concerns that her people have, and I just wanted to acknowledge that. And just to say, there's a real urgency to this, that these health issues are not abstract. People are suffering, and we know that tribal communities are extremely vulnerable and have higher exposures, particularly in the Arctic. And I think, while, you know, we really appreciate EPA's involvement and we have a cordial relationship with everyone there, I think we've also perceived that EPA has not always been as strong or as supportive as we would like them to be in the Stockholm Convention process in order to support the health and well-being of indigenous communities and communities all over the country. So, for instance, you know, I think EPA has actively worked to delay the listing of certain substances that we think warranted swifter action, and substances for which we felt that there was a strong base of scientific evidence. So we want to be science-based here. We know that the substances have to meet the criteria, but we also feel an urgency, because this is a very real health and human rights issue. Thank you.
EPA, do you have a response
Yes.
to this? So I think that's Larry. Do you have a question?
Yes. One comment, and also the comment, unfortunately, the Senate and Congress, when they get together, it sounds like a bowling convention. So I don't see that changing anytime soon either. So with that being the case, and you're not going to be able to get that ratification and move forward into the Stockholm Convention, I see that you are at least trying to mirror the convention's positions on most chemicals. But my question is, okay, you have guidelines on PCBs, which are dated and are in review. But part of those guidelines are not being reviewed are dealing with allowable byproduct PCB. How does that correlate with the Stockholm Convention?
Larry, this is Carissa. I think we're not sure exactly what you're talking about. So could you maybe be a little bit more specific when you're to byproduct PCB? Are you?
You allow 50 parts per million in products as a byproduct of any chemical process.
So you're talking about the PPM level.
Right. How does that correlate with the Stockholm Convention on PCBs?
Larry, this is John Shope. The Stockholm Convention, I think, has some of its own requirements, and we have ours under TSCA, so they're sort of separate, given that we're not parties yet. So
I understand, but how do they match up?
Our sense has been that they're relatively consistent. We've looked at this question. In fact, we just looked at it again this past summer. And I think we are generally of the view that, sort of the components, the individual components, we are generally in compliance. I think the difficulty occurs when you look at the actual sort of export and, import, requirements on some of these things where we may not have any exports that are currently occurring, but where we have no law in place that actually prevents those exports from happening, even though they're not actually occurring. So when you talk about compliance versus consistency, there's obviously a difference. So I think we are of the view that the majority of our laws are consistent with what was negotiated under Stockholm, but that we would need additional authority to ensure compliance. And I'm going to just...
Yeah, and I'd like to follow up. Some of the obligations for PCBs that are specific, this is Chris Blanc, by the way, that are specifically spelled out in Annex A and Part 2, and they do have provisions that refer to the concentration levels, and some of those relate to 50 parts per million or above. So there is some relationship with the levels we regulate at and approaches the treaty takes. Also for waste, I believe there's guidance documents, Basel guidance documents, which are available for consideration in the POPs context that treat levels below 50 parts per million as low levels, low PCB, low POPs levels for certain provisions of the treaty. Thanks.
This is Jennifer, and I don't see any remaining questions at this time. Pam, do you want to follow up with that?
Just to say that I think the loophole essentially that Larry is speaking of has to do with the Toxic Substances Control Act, and even though most uses were phased out under TSCA, this allowable level of PCBs in certain products of 50 parts per million is really just a loophole that needs to be closed, because I think it's resulting in some serious exposures, and that is something that EPA has the authority to do now. They don't have to wait until they're party to the convention. And then maybe just in closing, I did have some suggestions for how tribes can engage in this process that I didn't mention during my presentation.
Before you do that, Pam, I just
Sure.
want to give Larry, he has his hand up. I just wanted to see if he had another question before we do that. Okay, I guess we're all set. Go ahead, Pam.
Okay. Well, first of all, even though the U.S. is not yet a party to the convention, of course, tribes have consultative government-to-government rights with the State Department and EPA and can participate and make views known that way. And EPA and the State Department are always really good about organizing calls prior to the sessions of the POPs Review Committee as well as before the Conference of Parties. But tribes do have the direct government-to-government consultation. And secondly, you know, it would be great. We have this very small group of technical people that are part of IPEN that participate in the Pop Rock, but participating directly in the POPs Review Committee as well as the Conference of Parties is really another way that people can engage and tribes can particularly engage. And I mentioned the Global Indigenous Caucus, which has been a real force in the implementation of the treaty. I think we all need to work toward TSCA reform to ensure that we get a strong law in place and that allows for ratification of the treaty so the U.S. can participate as a party. And then tribes also have the right to participate on a consultative status basis with the United Nations as organizations such as International Indian Treaty Council and Inuit Circumpolar Council have. So those are just a few suggestions that I wanted to mention, and thank you, everyone.
And we do have a couple more questions. Diane, do you want to go ahead?
This is Diane Barton again. Pam, I was just wondering, you know, you were talking about the accumulation of toxics in breast milk. I was wondering if there were statistics as well on cancer rates of Arctic peoples and also, you know, in particular for children's cancer.
Hi, Diane. Thank you for that question. And the Arctic Monitoring Assessment Program has done some of that work in the Arctic so that the AMAP reports are good sources of information about health outcomes in rural communities in the circumpolar Arctic. However, I think one of the problems is that many of these communities are very small. And as Vi mentioned, there are significant numbers of people in the villages of St. Lawrence Island that have cancers, and that rate seems to be increasing. But it's very difficult to do epidemiological studies on communities that have small populations, so that's very hard to document. But there are some good studies out there that show nationally, that is, that certain types of childhood cancers are on the rise, as are learning and developmental disabilities, including things like autism and other immune system dysfunctions that can be related to toxic exposures. And in the communities that we work with, one of the big concerns is learning and developmental disabilities. And I think there's a lot of new scientific information out there about how exposure to some of these chemicals in the womb can have multi-generational effects on learning and development in children. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're working so hard to get some of these chemicals phased out. But I'd be glad to provide any of the scientific studies that we have access to, but the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program is a good source of information for the Arctic.
Thanks, Pam. And I apologize if Vi spoke to that already. I just really couldn't not understand because of the echoing what she had said.
And Vi's on the line and would like to comment as well.
If I can just add regarding the cancers and documenting, yes, we are a small population. However, our own health observations, we know our own communities, we know our health before. We have documentation that so 50 years ago we hardly had no cancer at all in our population. So that our own knowledge and our own elder and local knowledge has to be acknowledged just like scientific research that is needed. So we know our own community health. We are documenting the cancers in our population. because yes, it is a challenge, and there is not any research that has been done. However, the knowledge that we have as a community has to be taken into consideration, just like any other larger population cancer studies.
Thank you, Vi. Larry, did you have anything you wanted to follow up with?
The only thing that I would add is that this is a continuing problem, and it's one that we've tried to work with NTTC, with EPA, recognizing local knowledge with tribes is, fully as accurate, and in fact, in many cases, is more accurate than studies. Studies don't always give you the answers; they only give you data. And when you're looking at tribal communities, the impacts of these various chemicals, in particular PCBs, can really be horrendous. Cancer endpoint's really a minor endpoint, as I think Vi tried to bring up. And you have to look at the totality of the health effects, which is rather serious in most tribal communities. We need to somehow, EPA needs to figure out a way to move forward, particularly on PCBs, and eliminating them completely from the U.S. I mean, we're the most wealthy, industrialized nation in the world. The least we can do is minimize our pollution. That's all.
Thank you, Larry. We are coming up on our 90 minutes, and I just want to thank everybody. I want to thank Fred Corey and the Tribal Pesticides Council for initiating this topic. I want to thank Pamela Miller for bringing her expertise to the table, and for EPA to bring all their experts as well to be present, and appreciate all your time and efforts. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, bye. Okay, Pam, are you still there?
Yeah.
Okay, I think I have everybody else muted. Or if I don't, it doesn't matter. But I think I apologize for that muting problem. So it seemed like every time I had you unmuted, then it would echo.
Oh, that's okay. And that's why if I had something to say, I just typed a little message just to let you know. But it worked out fine.
Okay. And the other thing I failed to do was to start recording until halfway through your presentation.
Oh. Uh-huh.
And so I think I'm still going to go ahead and post what's there, and then just put in an email, to contact you directly for questions on the first half of the presentation. But then that way all the questions and comments were captured.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. And I thought Larry had a really good point at the end there, and I wanted to say that, prevention of disease is the most important thing, and that community-based research involves both traditional knowledge as well as, academic science, and that the studies don't always give the answers we want, but that's why community-based research is important, to take in the perceptions of and knowledge of people, and that's what we've done on St. Lawrence. But anyway,
I think there are a few people that are still listening in. I think I've just not shared my screen. So does anybody out there want to talk to Pam?
It's unbelievable.
They've got all kinds of voices going.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jennifer. I really appreciate the opportunity. If you get any other questions, or if I can help in any other way, let me know.
Okay, and I will. I really appreciate this, especially with our first one, that we got through things, and I hope to do a much better job the next time that you join us.
it worked.
Thanks so much.
All right. Well, thank you. Take care, Jennifer.
You
Bye-bye.
too. Bye-bye.